let's talk about the Sony RX100. Now in its 7th generation, the Sony RX100 is just about the best point-and-shoot camera you can find. In fact, with everything it can do, calling it a point-and-shoot seems a little bit dismissive. As you might know, I'm a big fan of Canon cameras and lenses, but this little Sony is super near and dear to me. When I started this channel a few years ago, I didn't have a DSLR that was good for video, and so pretty much the first like 50 videos on this channel were made entirely with the Sony RX100 Mark V. And that's really what I wanted to dive into today, is how does the Sony RX100 Mark V stack up against the newly released Mark VII. And just to jump ahead and spoil the entire video, I actually think that the Mark V is the best overall option for video. Unless you have a few really specific needs, then the Mark VII is definitely worth it. So let's start out by talking price. The RX100 Mark V is pretty much discontinued at this point, but you can still find it on some camera websites, and it's usually between $800 and $900, kind of depending on when you look. The new RX100 Mark VII retails for about $1,200, and that's a pretty huge price. When I got my Mark V a couple of years ago, I got it for $900, and at the time I thought that was way more money than I would ever spend on a non-interchangeable lens camera, a small point and shoot. But that $900 really ended up being totally worth it. $1,200 on the other hand is a lot more money, and honestly that puts you right in the price range of like a decent DSLR and lens setup. So if you're willing to spend $1,200 on a small camera like this, it really comes down to the size being a priority, the fact that you want a small, compact camera. And the small size is actually one of the best features of the entire RX series. These cameras are really small, but they are incredibly powerful. And so if you're looking to upgrade, you're curious about the Mark VII, or you have a Mark V and you're thinking about upgrading, or you want to buy one for the first time and you don't know if you should get an older model or the brand new model, there's a few things to compare. First, the form factor and build quality is almost identical between pretty much all of the RX series. There's a few minor improvements with the new cameras, but by and large, you really can't tell them apart. And that's a good thing, because these are super well-built cameras. They are really expensive, but once you get the camera and hold it, it feels like a premium device. It's mostly made out of metal, it's super sturdy. I've traveled all over the place with this one and it still works great, so they are really durable. Both cameras can record really nice looking 4K video, but they do have a 5-minute limit. The Mark V has a really strict 5-minute limit where the camera will just automatically turn off. The Mark VII was supposed to address that, but it seems like, at least from all the tests and things that I've seen and read, it's still an issue just because the camera gets so hot when you record 4K for too long. There's a lot of stuff happening in a really tiny space, and you can feel the camera heating up. And I think, at least with current technology, it just comes down to physics is something that is in the way of overheating not being an issue. But both cameras can also record 1080 pretty much indefinitely till your memory card or your battery runs out. I really love the video quality of the RX100 Mark V. The 4K is beautiful, even if you're not outputting at 4K and you're just downsizing to 1080, it looks terrific. Here's a short side-by-side comparison of the RX100 Mark V filming in 4K against the Canon EOS R filming at 1080p with the Sigma 24mm 1.4 lens. And now, just for the sake of a full comparison, this is the RX100 Mark V filming at 1080 against the Canon EOS R, also filming at 1080. The Mark V and the Mark VII also have electronic steady shot stabilization with different levels of variation, and it works really well. It's not as magical as like the GoPro or the Osmo Actions stabilizers are, but it's a really good, really effective stabilizer. Where some differences begin to emerge are with the lens. The Mark V uses a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, whereas the Mark VII uses a 24 to 200 millimeter lens. So that is a big difference in terms of telephoto capability, but that difference comes with a trade-off. The Mark V uses a faster 1.8 aperture, whereas the Mark VII uses a slower 2.8 aperture, and that could be a deal breaker depending on how you're going to use this camera. And I'm not sure of the technical details behind it, but it seems like that new lens made it not possible to have an ND filter built into the camera. The Mark V does have a built-in ND filter, but the Mark VII doesn't, and actually neither does the Mark VI for that matter. And speaking of the Mark VI, I'm kind of leaving it out, but the Mark VII and the Mark VI are almost identical. The upgrades with the Mark VII are that it has a few different high frame rate options, and it does have an external mic jack. So if you have a Mark VI, I don't think it's worth upgrading to the Mark VII unless you really need that external mic jack or you're doing really specific things with high frame rates. Otherwise, all the other features and the 24 to 200 millimeter lens are exactly the same on the 6 and the 7. So I'm kind of ignoring the 6 in this review and really focusing on the 5 versus the 7 because that's where the real big differences lie. Another similarity between pretty much all of the RX cameras is that the battery life is pretty terrible. Fortunately, all of these cameras take the exact same battery, and the batteries themselves aren't that expensive, so it's not too difficult to just buy some extras and keep them with you. And to be totally honest, I don't really fault these cameras for having poor battery life because there's so much packed into them that it just takes up so much power. It's this super small, super compact thing. There's only a certain size battery that's gonna physically fit in here, and to do all of those things, it's just gonna take a lot of power. So what is the biggest difference between the Mark V and the Mark VII? And in my opinion, it comes down to one really small but really important detail, and that is the external mic jack. The RX100 Mark VII is the first in the entire series to feature an external mic jack, so you can plug in pretty much any microphone or wireless unit that uses a 3.5 millimeter jack, and that can really improve the audio in whatever you're trying to produce. So does that make the higher price tag of the Mark VII worth it over the Mark V? In my personal opinion, it doesn't. The Mark VII has a few key features over the Mark V. It has much improved high frame rates. It does have that 70 to 200 millimeter lens, which could be really important if you want to be able to zoom in much further than this camera can. And it has that external mic jack, which is probably the biggest of the new features. But overall, I actually still think that the Mark V is better suited for people who want to shoot video because it does have that faster lens and it has those built-in ND filters. And with a camera like this, you're generally taking it a lot of different places, and a fast lens with a built-in ND filter just makes it more accessible to a wider variety of locations and environments and situations. The fact that it also comes in at a lower price point doesn't really hurt either. As much as I care about good audio quality and as much as I want to try and always get the best audio quality possible, the best feature about the Sony RX series is its compact size. So as soon as you start adding on a microphone, in my mind at that point, why not add on a different lens? And then I would rather just use a DSLR that gives me more options, better battery life, and just a lot more versatility. Because none of these cameras have accessory shoe mounts, they have a flash and a viewfinder that pop up, so that prevents you from mounting anything directly on top of them. So if you do want to mount a microphone to the Mark VII, you'll actually need a bracket, something that looks kind of like this, where you mount the camera on one side and then you can fit your microphone on the other side. This is the Rode Video Micro, so it's a pretty small mic. And then you end up with a rig that looks something like this. And this is still pretty small and compact, and it's gonna give you great video and great audio, but it's also not something that's gonna fit in your pocket or be super easy to carry around all the time, especially if you get to the point where then you start adding on some other kind of tripod or stabilizer or gimbal. At that point, you're dealing with a fairly sizable camera rig, so again, why not just start moving into the DSLR world? My favorite thing about the RX100 series is that it is small and compact. So without the bracket and the microphone, the camera itself will easily fit into your pocket. It's easy to carry with you. It's very inconspicuous when you're using it. And people can really underestimate when they see you out filming with a little camera like this, the crazy good results that you're going to get. And the cool thing too, when it's so compact, it's easier to take with you more often because I know that when I have a big camera or a big setup, if I take it with me somewhere, I feel like I have to use it. And if I don't use it, I feel like it was a waste of my time and my energy. Whereas when you're just taking this with you and a couple of extra batteries, if you end up not using it very much, it ends up not being a huge loss because it's not inconvenient to travel with. Now, of course, with the Mark VII, you still have the compact size, and then you do have the option to add the microphone and make it bigger if you want. And that is pretty cool. And if I had the choice to put a mic jack on this or not, I would definitely choose one. And to be fair, the built-in microphone isn't terrible on the RX100 Mark V. It's not amazing, but it's definitely usable, especially if you're close to the camera. What I've noticed is that to my ears, it sounds a little bit thin, but that's pretty easy to fix if you just add a bass boost equalizer in Final Cut Pro, and then you get pretty decent sounding audio. And my favorite compact setup is actually this little Manfrotto, I think it's called a Pixie tripod with the RX100, because it just screws right into the bottom. There's no mounting plates or anything like that. It's a pretty small, easy to use little handle. It's nice and sturdy. If you want to adjust it, there are no knobs or anything. There's just one push button that lets you adjust the camera and position it wherever you need it. So here's what it ultimately boils down to. I really think that the RX100 Mark V is still an awesome camera and still really, really usable. And I would urge you to consider either just keeping yours or choosing it over the Mark VII unless you need those specific features like a microphone jack or a longer lens or some very specific high frame rate options. Because as you probably know, I really love new camera gear and it's really fun to play with it and see how everything is advancing and use all of these new features. But one thing I think it's important for all of us to remember is that just because something new comes out doesn't mean the thing that you have isn't going to work just as good as it did the day that you bought it. In fact, here's a playlist I put together of some of my favorite videos on this channel that were filmed entirely using only the Sony RX100 Mark V.